For me, the quintessential late spring morning goes a little something like this. I awaken to a cool breeze blowing in the window. I rise, I stretch, I head to the kitchen, make a fresh pot of coffee. The aroma fills my nostrils. I reach for my empty coffee mug, and a little gray miller moth darts out of the empty mug and crashes into my face. That's life during miller moth season. They invade the Front Range every spring. They enter our homes, they annoy us, they even frighten us, and all we get out of it are stories like that one. Today, we unpack the mysteries of the miller moths. From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In the NOCO. I'm Erin O'Toole. Welcome to Miller Moth season. My guest today is Kareem Garbi. He's an entomologist and a horticulture specialist with Colorado State University. And he's here to tackle all of those questions we have about those insects we can't stop talking about this time of year, the miller moths. Kareem, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Erin.
So every spring, right around this time, miller moths start to show up pretty much everywhere on the Front Range. Where are they coming from?
So miller moths are kind of unique among moths in their seasonality. So they actually lay their eggs in the late summer to early fall. And those eggs hatch and then overwinter as larvae. So the moths that you are seeing they all hatched last year. They ate a bit, they became larvae, and then they spent the winter as caterpillars. And then so the following season, they become pupa and they become moths earlier this spring.
Okay. So they're a few months old at least. Where are they going then?
So yeah, they hatch down here in the lower elevations, and that's where they spend the winter. And then eventually, once they become moths, they'll eventually move up to the higher elevations. But the moths that we're seeing are like Front Range or like Denver born and raised. They'll leave eventually to complete their life cycle.
Now, I understand this has actually been a pretty mild year for miller moths. Why is that? And why are there fewer of them?
Yeah, there are a lot of factors affecting the population density of miller moths. The most pressing would be weather. So miller moths hatch out and they spend a couple of weeks or sometimes a couple of months here in the lower elevations. And they move up to the higher elevations as we approach summer. They're kind of triggered to move up by the rising temperatures. And so the reason that we had so many last year is that it was much cooler for much longer. So the miller moths were like, oh, it's still spring here. I'm going to hang out in the lower elevation for much longer time. Whereas this year, it's kind of gotten warmer quicker. So the miller moths, through their internal clock, they know that, okay, summer is approaching. The plants that I feed on, which primarily bloom in the higher elevation, they're going to be blooming sooner. Time for me to move up to the higher elevation to follow the flower forage.
Okay. All right. So they're going up. Well, miller moths are fairly common, and I know they're known as the army cutworm in the early stages of their lives. Why do you think miller moths fascinate people living on the Front Range?
I think it's just like the sheer number of them. It's almost like a plague described in biblical times. Like there's just so many of them, and they assault you. And
Right.
I think it's like a sheer annoyance of them, just like the fact that because whenever you disturb a room full of them, they fly and they flutter all over the place. And that's actually, there's a reason for that. These moths are often they're predated upon by bats. And so they're very sensitive to the fluttering of the bat wings. And so they think we're some kind of predator and yeah.
Well, I mean, why do they want to invade my house? And is there any way to keep them out?
Yeah, so miller moths, another fancy scientific term, they are thigmotactic, which means they like little narrow, cramped spaces. Like I always tell people to imagine it more easily. They like to be hugged on all sides. So they want to be in contact with the surface on all sides. And so they'll often creep into little cracks and crevices in homes. Usually these crevices are along doorways and vents and doors. And then they take like a wrong turn and then they get inside of the house and then it's impossible for them to get out.
Yeah.
And to deal with that, the primary way is to physical exclusion, seal up those cracks and crevices with caulk. You can buy it, any big box store, department store.
Mm-hmm.
The moths that are already inside the home can be kind of a nuisance. So I would put out sticky traps or glue boards for those. You can vacuum up their bodies. I see when you have lots of them, it can be a problem because one, like mice will come and feed on the dead miller moths.
Yeah.
And then there's another insect called a domestic beetle it likes to eat dry dead stuff, and so they will eat the miller moth corpses.
Oh, okay. Ugh.
Um,
Okay, so thigmotactic
yeah, thigmotactic.
means they could be hiding literally under anything, including an empty coffee mug. Got it. Now, Kareem, can miller moths do any damage, like to our clothing, for example?
No, the adults feed on just nectar, and the larvae are feeding on a variety of plants. They have a wide host range, so they'll feed on some broadleaf plants, sometimes grasses. They may be a threat to certain plants in the landscape and garden, but nothing inside the home. The moths that attack, your clothes or your pantries are completely different species.
Okay. Well, then let me ask you this. What good are they? Do they have a role in our ecosystem? Do they serve a purpose?
Definitely. Miller moths, I'd say the most important function is being pollinators, and they are nocturnal pollinators. So you often find them flying around at night pollinating plants, and some plants have adapted to this partnership with nocturnal pollinators where their flowers may be only open at night for these moths, or they have their peak nectar flow in the evening hours. Beyond being pollinators, I would say miller moths are also a really important source of food for a lot of other organisms. I've noticed if you live in Denver or anywhere in the Front Range, you'll notice swallows, those birds that'll fly down near cars like in traffic.
Oh, yeah, at the intersections.
Exactly. And sometimes people will have like tons of miller moths trapped in their car and they'll open the windows to release them. And then the swallows will come and like grab the miller moths as they're flying out.
Oh, that's a really
Yeah.
good idea. And actually, I love to watch that dance. I do not mind being at an intersection watching all those swallows get their dinner. Kareem, my dog seems to love playing with them and then eating them. Is that safe for her? And is there a reason why they taste good to dogs?
Yeah, there's probably no risk to your dog. I mean, everything in moderation. I wouldn't have her replace her whole meal with miller moths, but the moths are certainly not toxic like a monarch or another type of, poisonous butterfly. As for why she is so obsessed with them, I don't know. I don't speak dog.
She might be part cat. I'm not sure about
It's
that.
fair.
Before we go, I want to ask you what your favorite fact is about miller moths.
I would say just like the migration, I know like other insects, some have, like cross-country migrations like the monarchs. I just think it's cool how the miller moths, every year they hatch out in the lower elevations, they move up to the higher elevations, and then they come back. Like they have this biphasial habitat, and they're important in both areas too.
Oh,
Like they're serving as food for organisms in one area, and then also like here I know there's a lot of parasitic wasps and predators that feed on them, and then the higher elevation I've heard of bears overturning rocks to like feed on all the miller moths that are hiding in those little cramped spaces.
oh, wow. I don't know whether to be disgusted or impressed with that. That's pretty cool. Well, Kareem, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Kareem Garby is a horticulture specialist with CSU. And we love hearing from our listeners. If you have a miller moth horror story to share or an idea for something you think we should be talking about, let us know. Email noco@kunc.org. That's it for us today on In the NOCO. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.